"2022 marked the first official chapter of a new story for so many people across the world. Whatever our stories from lockdowns or restrictions, or loved ones who didn't make it to be here with us, the world as a whole started moving on from the difficulties of the pandemic and reassessing what the future will bring. And one of those people starting their new path was Xana Kernodle. She was born in Co.AG in Idaho on July 5th, 2002, meaning that 2022 was her first step into the big wide world of being in your 20s. She was an athletic, outgoing and happy young woman who grew up loving being outdoors and sports and became a successful gymnast. She loved music and concerts and was known by family and friends for her ability to always see the positives, and that was something that would come in handy when she graduated high school in 2020, trying to figure out what all of the restrictions would mean for her graduation ceremony, and then only focusing on the bright future ahead of her. And she knew what she wanted to do. She enrolled in Idaho University and started on her marketing degree, almost immediately getting involved in the local community of Moscow, Idaho, and life on campus. She got a job at a local restaurant, she joined the Pi Beta Phi sorority, and she got herself a boyfriend, Ethan Chapin. Ethan and Xana together were later described as a couple that, quote, made people believe in true love. Ethan was said to always be loving and kind and supportive towards Xana, something that most definitely speaks to the kind of person he was, but this also could have come from him knowing what it truly meant to share your life with somebody. Ethan was born in Seattle, the eldest of triplets. Soon after him, his brother and sister were born, and the three of them were together ever since. He almost always had one of his siblings around, even when he was playing sports at school, and he got to play on the same team as his brother. And Ethan loved sports. This was something that he had in common with Xana, but his final years of high school had a bit of a different effect on him. With the schools closing during the pandemic, Ethan and his siblings had nowhere to go for what would have been the last but 1 year of high school. Not wanting to do nothing, he and his brother and sister headed to Idaho, where they worked at the Hills Resort through the summer, and came back home, hoping that they could go to school for their final year. But their school stayed shut, and the three of them then found themselves with a lot of time on their hands. They worked in Tulip Town for tulip season, and when the summer rolled around, they headed back out to Idaho to work at the Hills Resort once again. Maybe it was these summers of being outside and finally getting to do something that influenced all three of them, because before anyone knew it, they had all enrolled in Idaho University. Ethan decided to study recreation, sport, and tourism management, and joined the Sigma Chi fraternity, meeting Xana along the way, but he wasn't as into his degree as she was. With the world now being finally back open, Ethan wanted to make sure that he was living his life to the fullest. He went to his lectures, but as soon as they were over, he'd head to the beach to play volleyball or surf, or he'd just be outside playing pickleball and golf. But through all of that, he still had plenty of time for Xana, and when she moved into a house just outside of campus, he found himself spending more and more time there as well. The house itself was literally only separated from campus by a field, and it was in a good neighbourhood. The town of Moscow only has about 25,000 people living in it, about double the amount when the university is in session, so even at its highest, it's still a small town made up of a really tight-knit community. A local once described it as somewhere where you only have to go out 2 or 3 links in your social circle before you'll find somebody who's connected to someone else in some way. And that was exactly what you could see happening in that 3-story house that Xana moved into. Xana rented a bedroom on the 2nd floor, meaning that she was on the floor that actually had the most of the communal living spaces and the back door. The house had been built on a hill, so the layout of the floors were different to more conventional housing plans. The 1st floor had the front door and the parking spaces in front of it. There were 2 bedrooms down there and a stairway that led up to the 2nd. The 2nd floor had more bedrooms, the kitchen and the living room, and the back door that opened up to the back garden and faced the woods behind the house. And the 3rd floor had 2 more bedrooms and a balcony that also faced the woods. When Xana moved into the house, she was moving in with someone that she was connected to in quite a few ways. They both studied the same degree in Idaho University, they were both a member of the Pi Beta Phi sorority, and they both worked in the same restaurant in town. That person was Madison May Mogan, or Maddie as she liked to go by. Maddie was only a year older than Xana, but the two got on like a house on fire. Maddie was born in Eugene, Oregon, but her family were originally from Idaho, and they ended up moving back home when Maddie was only about 2 years old. She was bright and warm and outgoing, and always ready to help and give advice when she could, especially to the people close to her. But there was no one closer to Maddie than Kaylee Jade Goncalves. Kaylee was originally from Concord, California. She was the middle of 5 children, and from the moment she was born, she brought a sense of joy and mystery to her family. She'd been born with a scar on her forehead, something not even the doctors had been able to explain, but Kaylee's siblings thought that they had the answer, and Kaylee spent a lot of her childhood trying to prove that they were wrong. According to Kaylee's siblings, the scar was left over from where her horns had tried to grow in, but by the time Kaylee had started at Charter Middle School, her warmth and bright personality had already proved that she was no devil. Kaylee was full of life and full of love, and when she and Maddie met in school, there was no stopping them. They were always talking or doing something together, making each other laugh and making everyone else laugh too, and both of their families later said that the day that Maddie and Kaylee had walked into each other's lives was the day that both sides gained another daughter. But Maddie and Kaylee's friendship was tested when it came time to choose which high school they would be going to, and there was talk of them going to different ones. Both of the girls knew that they wanted to be together, so they wrote decisive but firm letters to their parents, explaining why they should both go to Lake City High School, and who were their parents to stand in their way. They both got what they wanted, and they both proved that it had been worth it when they did well, both socially and academically, and when the time came to choose where to study university, they knew that they also wanted to stay together. Both of them enrolled in Idaho University, with Maddie studying marketing and Kaylee studying to become an elementary school teacher, and this was a time where Maddie truly shined. She joined the Pi Beta Phi sorority, got a job off campus, and worked incredibly hard, making the dean's list for every semester she was at the school, something which wouldn't have happened if she'd let her grades slip even once. And that put her firmly connected with Xana Kernodle when Maddie and Kaylee moved into that same house in Moscow. They took both bedrooms on the 3rd floor. This meant that it was them at the very top of the house, Xana on the 2nd floor with another roommate in the other room called Dylan Mortensen, a young woman called Bethany Funk on the 1st floor also. There was also another roommate still on the lease, but it looked like he'd moved out by November of 2022, and Ethan wasn't living in the home, but was at the house very often, just like he was on November 12th, when Kaylee posted this picture to Instagram and said, quote, One lucky girl to be surrounded by these people every day. The picture shows Maddie sitting on Kaylee's shoulders and Ethan and Xana standing just beside them. But what should have been another happy and fond memory and social media post had turned into the complete opposite by the same time the very next day. It was Saturday night at a college town, and everyone in the house was determined to enjoy it. Bethany and Dylan went to a party. Xana and Ethan went to another party at the Sigma Chi fraternity house on campus, and on the third floor, Kaylee and Maddie went to a local bar to enjoy a night out. Everyone stayed where they were until about 1 a.m, when Bethany and Dylan were the first to return to the house, and they headed straight for bed. The next time that we can pin any of the other roommates is at 1:41 a.m, when Kaylee and Maddie were spotted on a live stream. This particular live stream was for a local food truck, who apparently streams shifts at the truck all the time, but this particular stream would become very important in a very short amount of time. Kaylee and Maddie are seen walking into the area with a young man in a white hoodie, either with them or following close behind them. He doesn't appear to speak to the girls, and the girls don't speak with him either, but they go up to the counter of the food truck and order some food. The man in the hoodie is seen lingering at the back of the queue, not really getting in it and not ordering any food himself, but keeping an eye on the girls. Neither of the girls seemed upset or even distressed that he's with them, and the manager at the food truck said that they'd seemed fine when he'd ordered their food. They also would have had plenty of time and plenty of people around them that could have done something, or they could have gone to if this young man had really been following them, because they ended up waiting about 10 minutes for their food. Then the young man in the white hoodie walked back up to the girls, again not saying a word, but again the girls seemed to ignore him. The way that he ends up standing with them on screen does suggest that he is a part of their group, and when another man approaches and starts talking with him, he does apparently say that he's with the two girls. But only a few minutes later and the girls take off, rushing off screen towards the road where a driver is waiting for them. They don't say goodbye to the young man in the hoodie, and when the second man points and tells him that the girls are leaving, the young man takes off down the road, away from the girls. With what would happen in the following hours, this stream made international news, and many internet sleuths went through it frame by frame, trying to piece together the answer to a mystery that has left many families devastated. Xana and Ethan arrived home around the same time that the girls were ordering food, and when the girls arrived home a little after 2 a.m, the house should have gone quiet. But all the way up on the third floor, Kaylee and Maddie were busy on their phones. Kaylee was trying to reach her ex-boyfriend, and she called him 7 times between 2:30 and 2:52 a.m. Maddie then called him another 3 times, but he didn't answer any of the calls, and many people have been left wondering if things would have turned out differently if he had. Maybe everything would have been completely different, maybe nothing would have changed at all, but what we can say for certain is that something truly horrible happened in that house in the early hours of Sunday morning, and it never should have. At around 12 on Sunday, the police department in Moscow received a phone call. It was from one of the roommates, and they said that it looked like someone in the house had lost consciousness. The first responders didn't really know what to expect, especially when the roommate on the phone admitted that they hadn't known what to do and had already asked another couple of friends to come over and help. By this point, the authorities were probably thinking that this was a case of a college student having a few too many, and maybe a trip to the hospital would be needed, but that was, unfortunately, not the case. Kaylee and Maddie had slept in the same bed the night before, so they were in one bedroom upstairs, and Xana and Ethan were in Xana's bedroom on the second floor. We're not sure which bedroom the first responders went into, but it unfortunately wouldn't have made much difference. Both of the rooms were covered in blood, and all 4 of the roommates had been stabbed to death in their sleep. Each victim had been stabbed multiple times, and as of right now, it's reported that only 2 of them showed any signs of defensive wounds. All hell broke loose after the bodies were discovered, especially because no one could say if there was a killer on the loose who was targeting students or not, and the university immediately issued a warning, asking students to stay wherever they were until they could figure out what was going on. And the first place anyone and everyone turned to was the 2 surviving roommates, Bethany and Dylan. This was one of the first twists in this case because many people couldn't understand Bethany and Dylan's story. They didn't really have much of one. According to both of them, they'd been the first ones home and the first ones to go to sleep, and they'd slept all the way through the night and not heard a thing. The house showed no signs of forced entry, and everyone had a hard time believing that the 4 people who got brutally murdered like that in the same house, with 2 of them having not heard it, seemed odd, especially when one of them lived on the exact same floor as Xana and Ethan. But a lot of emphasis was publicly put on the layout of the house. Someone entering from the back door would have entered onto the second floor, and if they had no idea that there was another floor below them, then they may have not thought to go down there. That would possibly explain how Bethany had survived, but what about Dylan? A lot of emphasis was then put on the lack of defensive wounds. All 4 victims had been killed in their sleep, meaning that they hadn't been able to shout or make a noise to ask for help, and even if they had, the layout of the house could have stopped the noise from travelling between floors to begin with. The investigators ruled Bethany and Dylan out as suspects, but they didn't explain why they'd been spared, unless leaving them behind had just been an accident. The leading theory turned out that someone in the house had been targeted and the others had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. If either Maddie or Kaylee had been the target, it would explain why the other one had been killed as well, because they'd been sleeping in the same bed that night. But if that's true, then what about Xana and Ethan? They were on the second floor. If the killer had come through the back door, the first bedroom they would have come across would have been Xana's, and maybe the killer didn't realise that they had been in the wrong room until it was already too late. Then they went upstairs and killed the people they'd really been after and disappeared back into the night, either knowingly or unknowingly leaving Bethany and Dylan alive. But who would want to hurt Kaylee or Maddie? The footage of the young man in the white hoodie became an overnight internet sensation, with hundreds, maybe even thousands of people trying to figure out who he was so that they could call it into the police. Some of them didn't even wait and just ended up calling the investigators to try get him arrested, but the police didn't need much help tracking him down. With Moscow being a rather small town, they actually found him very quickly, and they also were very quickly able to rule him out as a suspect. But in so many ways, that was the last thing that the community and the 4 victims' families wanted to hear. Everyone wanted to know who had done this, and they wanted to know that the streets were safe again. Parents started pulling students off campus, with an estimated 11,000 students not returning to classes since news of the attack broke. And the police wanted to let everyone know that they were doing everything in their power to catch the killer. They made an announcement on the 15th where they said, quote, "Based on the information from the preliminary investigation, investigators believe this was an isolated, targeted attack, and there is no imminent threat to the community at large." But official statements from the Moscow police and other officials have been confusing at best. Only the very next day, Police Chief James Fry announced, quote, "We cannot say there is no threat to the community, and as we have stated, please stay vigilant, report any suspicious activity, and be aware of your surroundings at all times." They later announced a list of people who had been cleared as suspects. Bethany, Dylan, and the young man in the white hoodie were all included in it, and so were 2 male suspects who'd allegedly stalked Kaylee at one point, though the investigators say that the claims had been exaggerated. They did say that the murder weapon was a fixed blade, Rambo-style hunting knife, and urged any businesses who have sold that kind of knife recently to come forward with information. Criminologist and pathology professor Casey Jordan gave her take on the killer's choice of weapon in an interview with Today. She said that this kind of weapon suggested that the murders was premeditated and more than likely was committed because the killer wanted to commit them, either for the thrill or the joy, or for revenge, and she cautioned the police to be on the lookout for someone with a history of abuse, especially towards animals. This all takes us up to December 2022, only a little over a month after the murders took place. A vigil was held on December 2nd in honour and memory of the victims and in support of their families, but the community as a whole is still reeling. A recent quote from university officials state that it's possible that 40% of students have not returned to their lessons and are not expected to by the end of the holiday season. If this works out as officials feared, this will have a knock-on effect on the community, especially when that community itself is a small town where many local businesses and families support themselves through the university and with the students that the university brings in. And there's a lot of hurt and pain for those closest to the 4 young people who tragically lost their lives. During this difficult time, Kaylee's parents, especially her father, Steve, have found themselves on the receiving end of more than a few critical announcements from the police department, calling them out for sharing information that the police weren't ready to make public. Steve Goncalves publicly fired back by claiming that the police haven't been sharing enough information with the community and the families, and even hired a lawyer to try force the department to share more. This conscientious relationship started over the police allegedly going to the media to ask for the public to come forward with any information on a white car that was seen speeding past a local gas station around the time of the murders were thought to have occurred. Steve argued that this information should have been shared with the families first before it was made public, but other reports have it as him spreading the news to the media before the police were ready for word to get out. Either way, his pain is completely understandable, but it is important to remember that in an open investigation, the police will not be able to share everything that they have without potentially damaging their case, or maybe even letting the suspect know that they are onto them. Even with open and shut cases, it takes time to collect evidence, and in a case as terrible as this one, it's important to catch the right person to make sure that they can't repeat their actions again. The Moscow Police Department announced that as of December 6th, they have received over 2,640 emails, over 2,700 phone calls, and 1,804 digital media submissions regarding this case from the public. But they are working their way through the tips and through the evidence found in and around the crime scene. And let's remember that Moscow is a small town. Maybe that's why it shouldn't have been such a shock to so many of them when the police tracked down the owner of that white car. It belonged to Brian Koberger, a 28-year-old criminology PhD student studying at Washington State University, and the police have been onto him almost from the very beginning. He was arrested on December 30th of 2022, and almost immediately his arrest warrant explained quite a few things to the public. The first being that there had been more than a few cover-ups in the initial police announcements. It was true that Bethany down on the first floor hadn't heard anything, but that wasn't true for someone else in the house. The roommate, who was quoted as only DM, said that she'd heard and even seen quite a few things that night. She'd actually gotten out of bed once when she thought she'd heard someone walking around the house, and another time when she thought she'd heard crying from upstairs. Quote, "Don't worry, I'm going to help you," she'd heard next, and DM opened her door trying to figure out what was happening when she saw a man walk past her, his face covered in what looked like a black ski mask, only his eyes and his bushy eyebrows visible when he headed towards the back door. The man either didn't see DM or he did and he didn't care, but completely terrified, DM reportedly shut her bedroom door and waited until morning to come back out again. With this information at hand, the police decided to announce that the surviving roommates hadn't seen or heard anything, hoping to protect them in case the killer came back, and decided to cover his tracks. And then they got to work. Moscow being such a small settlement, rumours about the white car began circling, and then the footage did as well. It had been caught on CCTV a few times in and around town, sometimes speeding, sometimes just driving around, and by mid-December the police had eyes and ears on Brian Kohberger at all times. With pressure from all around, including the new lawyer hired by Kaylee's family, demanding that the police released more information on the case and named a suspect, the department kept a tight lid on things, watching and waiting for their moment to strike. Over the Christmas holidays, they managed to collect a DNA sample from a bin outside of Brian Kohberger's family home in Pennsylvania, and they got a match. The DNA from the bin had a familial match to the DNA found at the crime scene, meaning that someone in that house was the father of the person who'd left the DNA at the crime scene with almost 100% certainty. With that, the investigators were able to get both an arrest and a search warrant, and they moved quickly. Brian was arrested in Pennsylvania, and the police went back to his home in Idaho, where they found more than a few things of interest. After the warrant was unsealed, a complete list of everything the police had seized from Brian's home was released as well. But to name just a few items on the list, the police took disposable gloves, several receipts, several possible hairs and hair strands, a computer tower, and samples from bedding and mattresses that had red or brownish stains on them. Since his very public arrest and transfer into custody, many more rumours and speculative connections to the victims have kept circling. Gag orders have been put in place, changed, renewed, or updated, and the world has been left waiting with bated breath to see what will happen next. Brian remains in custody, but a change in his legal representation has put hold on the whole trial. He hasn't entered a plea as of yet, and with the potential of a lethal injection waiting for him at the end of all of this, it doesn't exactly look like either he or his legal team are in any rush to get things moving again. He had a preliminary hearing on the 12th of January 2023, but his defence lawyers argued that because they were new to the case, they hadn't had time to put together a proper defence, and the hearing was pushed back by 6 months. It looks like that will be the next time we're likely to get any concrete evidence in this case, especially with the gag orders in place, and it looks like that will be the next time that the victims' families will be able to see Brian in court. This must be an incredibly difficult time for anyone who knew and loved the victims, especially their families. But a case like this has the ability to touch the hearts of so many, especially when so many young and promising lives were cut short for no apparent reason. Kaylee, Maddie, Xana, and Ethan, people who were described as, quotes, gifts to the world in their own special way, deserve for the person who did this to them to be behind bars. And for the rest of us, waiting on the sidelines to find out if that person is indeed Brian Kohberger or not, the only thing we can do is be there to support the victims' families and the police department, and be the support that they need in a terrible time such as this.